Hello, I'm Dr. Martha Leatherman.
And I'm Dr. Beth Godey, and this is the second of 3 20-minute segments on the topic of caregiver stress, and we hope you joined us for the first segment. Each of these segments builds on one another, but you don't have to watch, and we'd like for you to watch them in order, but you don't have to watch them all at the same time. You can find the segments on www.mmlearn.org. What we'd like to do today is review a little bit about the first segment and then talk to you some more about how you can manage your stress.
Now there's a little activity at the end of each segment, and we don't want you to feel like you have to do the activities, but they don't take much time and they're fun and they're also very helpful for people. So if you can find a few minutes to do the activity, go ahead and do that. Remember from the first part how we talked a little bit about how stress affects your body and how much time you actually spend caregiving, and how you might not even realize the amount of time that you spend caregiving. We showed you a little activity where you can list the amount of time that you spend taking care of your loved one versus how much time you spend taking care of yourself and even sleeping. And then there's a 24-hour clock that you can look at and use to kind of get a visual idea of just how much time you're spending as a caregiver. For those of you joining us in segment 2, the 24-hour clock can be found at www.dignityfirst.net, and you can click on the button that says Caregiver Stress and see that clock. If you made your list, look at the list and think, is there anything, no matter how small, that you can eliminate from that caregiving list? Is there something that you could ask somebody else to do? Or is there something that's really not absolutely necessary? Because if you can add a little bit from that caregiving list to the My Time list, that's going to help you find some time to take care of yourself and reduce your caregiver stress.
Now, we talked last time about how frustrating it is when people give you advice about how to manage your stress, but tell you that you need to take some time off or breathe or relax.
And go out more.
Go out more, as if you have the time. Because the caregiving is stressful because your loved one never leaves. They're always there needing you. So no matter how much you try to get away or to relax, you can't ever leave the caregiving behind.
And all the work that you have to do, all the responsibilities you have, don't leave. And just somebody telling you, relax, take a deep breath, take care of yourself, doesn't make those things leave. And you know that they're not going to leave. The thing is, it doesn't have to be frustrating and hopeless. We recognize the reality of the work that you have to do, but that doesn't mean that you have to be frustrated and exhausted all the time.
There are ways that you can manage the stress. It's true that you can't get rid of the stressful situation, but there are ways to manage your response to it, your stress response.
You know, one of the things that makes people feel bad and stressed is feeling out of control. We have a need to feel in control, and the feeling of control is comforting on some level, because then we think we're in charge of the situation. We can control how fast things go or how slowly things go. We can make things stop, at least in our own minds. So we grab tighter and tighter and tighter to that control as a way to kind of comfort ourselves. And we've all been in the situation when you're in a car and you're the passenger and not the driver. It's a lot more comfortable to be the driver than it is to be the passenger, and you've probably even found yourself stepping on that imaginary brake as the passenger when the driver is going too fast or some way that you think is out of control. So when we feel out of control, we can feel completely overwhelmed. What you need to do, the trick when you're feeling overwhelmed by that feeling of being out of control, is to stop and ask yourself, what have I lost control of? Start paying attention to that. Just be mindful of it. And over time, you'll begin to see a pattern.
You know, Martha, you really ought to tell your pager story, because it's a great illustration of what she's talking about with that sense of loss of control. So tell them that. This is a great story.
The famous pager
The famous
story.
pager story.
Well, this is thanks to my children. Back when we only carried pagers, and now we use cell phones a lot, but I carried a pager all the time, and the noise is piercing when that pager goes off. And one day, one of my children asked me, "Mommy, why do you get mad at us every time the pager goes off?" And after feeling guilty and out of control, then I started thinking and paying attention to this pattern, and I recognized that every time that piercing pager sound went off, I thought, what disaster is it? Who is sick? What did I forget to do? What am I going to have to do to manage this disaster? And then I started realizing that very rarely was it a disaster, but my mind jumped to disaster every time it went off. And so I became stressed, overwhelmed, anxious, and snappy at my kids, who, of course, thought I was mad at them about the pager. So once I recognized my thoughts when that pager went off, I could stop before I had any reaction and say, maybe it's not a disaster. This might be something good. Let's wait and see what it is before we get anxious and stressed.
Well, you're right that it's not always a disaster, but what if there is a disaster? What can you do about that? How can you regain your sense of control even if a disaster happens? Well, the trick to this is thinking, what disasters do you fear out of caregiving? What disasters do you want to avoid, but what do you really fear? Make a list of those, and then you can work on a plan to try and solve them, or how you're going to take care of the disaster before it happens. You don't want to wait until the disaster happens and then try to come up with a plan while you're in the middle of all the stress and feeling overwhelmed. You want to plan ahead, because that will really help with calming you down when the disaster happens. Now, the disaster may be anything from my loved one wandering off, or finding my loved one having fallen in their home and they broke their hip.
Or had a stroke, or you're going to have to move to a different place.
Have to go to the hospital, or, as you said, can no longer live in their home by themselves, and you've got to come up with a plan there. So it's very important to do that ahead of time, so that when the disaster happens, and disasters will happen, you can say to yourself, instead of, oh no, what do I do? You can say, well, I've thought this out, I've got a plan, and I can do the best that I can do. I'm not going to try and second guess myself. All I can expect is that I can do my best. One of the things you can also do when you're planning ahead, though, is you can call community organizations like the Alzheimer's Association and ask for some advice or resources. And another important thing to do is to contact your family and friends and go over your plans with them. This is what I plan on doing in case Mom has to go to the hospital. And they'll be glad to help you with some advice and some options, and they may even offer ahead of time some support that you can depend on when the disaster occurs.
You know, it's also important, though, to give yourself a break. Know that you are doing the very best that you can. Even if somebody tells you that you're doing the best you can, we know that doesn't really relieve the guilt. After all, there must be something more I can do. I should have visited more often. I should have cooked better food.
I should have been more patient. I should have been more pleasant.
We bet that you have your own list of I shouldas. Really, though, didn't you do your best?
And you really have to look at the whole caregiver situation. You can't just base how well you're doing on one or two instances.
You know, you would not expect your best from anybody else any more than you do from yourself. So if your friend does his or her best, if your sister does her best, you don't expect more than that from them. Why are you expecting more than your best from yourself? You know, the guilt comes from feeling like you've fallen short of this imaginary perfection mark in your mind. And nobody can reach that. It would take superhuman efforts in order to reach that imaginary perfection. And you're not superhuman. Nobody is.
Now, remember, last segment we talked about how we found that caregivers have tunnel vision and don't often see options or any kind of way to get any kind of help. And they'll get to the point, and you may have found this in yourself, where they won't accept help even when it's given. And we hear this so much, is that when help is offered, the first thing caregivers think is, well, if I ask for help, it means I'm failing as a caregiver. I'm not doing a very good job. And the other thing that happens is caregivers will say, well, if I bother somebody else and ask them for help, I'm really imposing. Now I've become a burden on my friends because I ask for help. And this is the time when you really need to reach out for help and not stay closed in and afraid that if you ask for help, you really have failed, because you have not.
So think about a couple of things. First of all, you need to look at the overall caregiving that you do, not each isolated incident. Overall, we think you're probably doing a fine job. And we imagine that you're not giving yourself enough credit. And we want you to give yourself the same amount of credit that you would give a friend who was doing the same thing. Give yourself that break. Also, recognize that if a situation comes up that you haven't planned on, that's the perfect time to ask for help. The trick is to think that you don't have to do it all by yourself, that there are people to help you. And remember not to become closed in and have that tunnel vision. You know, sometimes the people who love you don't want to see you hurting. They don't like to see you under so much stress and duress. They want to help you. And you need to allow them to help you because they don't know how. Doesn't it make you feel good when you can help somebody? Well, of course it does, and you need to allow them that caregiving of you too. It's a kindness on your part to tell them what they can do to help.
You know, what happens is your guilt can become a source of stress, so that it keeps us from taking action and asking for any assistance. But really, you should give yourself a break and know that you would think that your friend who is in the same situation as you is doing a good job. So you should feel that way and tell yourself, I'm doing the best I can, because you really are. We know you're doing a very good job. But the relationship you're in, the caregiver relationship we're talking about here, is one of closeness and love, such as husband and wife or child and parent. And there are a lot of emotions wrapped up in those relationships when they're that close and loving, and it can become pretty conflicted and complex.
And sometimes there's a source of guilt from that level of relationship. The guilt itself, like we said, can be stressful. When a loved one's ill, whether it's a long physical illness or dementia or a stroke, sometimes the person becomes angry, irritable, even a tyrant, and so you feel guilty because you might not feel like you're doing enough. Sometimes family members who live far away will criticize you, and they don't understand all the problems that you're involved with the caregiving. And this can be a source of caregiver stress as well.
That's exactly right. And you have to recognize that your loved one who's ill may be saying things that are hurtful out of their own frustration and their own depression or their own problems handling their illness. Or maybe they don't even realize what they're saying and they will say something hurtful to you, and they wouldn't ordinarily say that. You have to recognize that it's the illness, not the person you love trying to be mean.
And in the same way with family members, it's helpful to recognize that their criticism is a reflection of how they're having trouble coping with the situation. And so if you can take things not so personally and understand your family's limitations as well as the fact that they can't possibly know everything that's involved, that will take some of the pressure off of you.
And you know, when your family members criticize you or other people try to give you advice that doesn't make much sense, instead of taking it personally, we always say don't take it personally, but instead use that as an opportunity to talk with them about what help they can give you. That'll be a great opportunity for you to connect with your family and for them to feel as if they're doing something for you. Now, we don't want to make you feel even more guilty, but you know, when you're under stress, when you're in a hurry, when you're angry about something, when you're irritated, or you're sad, or you've got your mind on something else, really the person who may be most affected by that is your loved one, because they're not sure why you're angry or why you're upset, and they may respond by becoming tearful or withdrawn, or it may be harder to take care of them, and then that raises your stress because you become irritable with them, and now you're in an ugly, vicious cycle. So when you find that you are having difficulty taking care of your loved one, or you feel irritable when you're with them, that's a great sign for you to think, this means I need to ask for help.
Asking for help is difficult. And in the next part of this series, we'll show you how you can ask for help. But for right now, here's your activity. Make a list of everybody who's ever offered to help you that you can think of, even if you thought they weren't serious, like friends, family, people from church, people from the doctor's office,
people you've worked with, or maybe your loved one worked with. Anybody who even said in a vague way, I'm thinking about you, or let me know what I can do. Make a list of all those people, and we think you'll be surprised at how long your list is.
Try that activity today. Think about the things that we've learned, which is what is stress, the symptoms of stress. We've learned to recognize some stress triggers, and you've learned some reasons that it's important to manage your own stress, both for your own health and your loved one. And we will see you